Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. We are here to talk about the environmental and sustainability risks for your downstream threats to the supply chain. By way of agenda points, we will just do a brief introduction to who BSI is. We'll go over just some of the dynamics of environmental legislation and the different types of legislation that exist. We will then go over a best-in-class practice or 3 steps to develop an environmental supply chain risk assessment program and outline what those 3 steps entail so that you're able to take this away and hopefully develop one for yourself. So again, just a quick introduction to who BSI is. BSI stands for British Standards Institution. And we were one of the world's first national standards body, founder of the International Standards Organization. So you may know the name BSI from ISO 9001. We helped author that standard, or some of the ISO world standards that exist and we certify to. Today I'm joining you from the BSI Professional Services Division, which is really the non-accredited arm of BSI. So we help companies develop their own standards and requirements in a non-accredited way, and then look externally to their supply chain and assessing those requirements downstream throughout your different business partners and supply chain actors. We do that in a number of different ways. But I just want to touch really quickly how BSI is, despite the name British Standards Institution, is actually a global organization. We have about 60 offices worldwide with 3 regional hubs here in the UK, in Hong Kong for the Asia-Pac region, and then in Washington, D.C. for the U.S. Americas region. So we do work in a number of different countries with about delivering assessments and clients in about 150 countries worldwide. So despite the B in British, we actually are a global organization. And then just the last point of introduction to the Supply Chain Solutions Division and what we do here. We really help companies in 3 different facets. The first is through intelligence and country risk. So we have an intelligence platform called SCREEN. And SCREEN stands for Supply Chain Risk Exposure Evaluation Network. Hence why we have the acronym, because it's a lot of words for that. And essentially what SCREEN is it's that one-stop shop intelligence on any type of supply chain related risks. We have short-term risk for different news events that happen, as well as long-term risk analysis for country-level analysis that is in the format of global risk heat maps, as well as analysis and full reporting on each country in areas of 4 pillars of risks: business continuity risk, security risks, social and ethical risks, and then environmental risk, which we're here to talk about today. Then the second offering BSI works with clients is what we call the audit platform or supplier compliance manager. And essentially what this is we overlay the country risk we have with the intelligence with assessment and audit results. So it's a risk assessment platform. So you upload your supplier base, facilitate self-assessments, host on-site audit results, and it allows you to have that macro level visibility into your supplier risks, as well as drilling down to see individual supplier risk reports, so that you have an overall picture of where are your weak spots in your supply chain and what areas do you need to facilitate corrective actions through the tool. So it really is that one-stop shop platform for all of your audit and assessment risk analysis and management of your supplier base. And then finally, due to our global reach and our global presence, BSI is an auditing body as well, where we can carry out second-party, non-accredited audits on your behalf. So you hand us your list of suppliers, we go out and work into the factories to assess where the risks are for your suppliers and provide a full audit report at the end. And this is the service we call Verify. And that's essentially us, again, auditing on your behalf and being an extension of your team, your eyes and ears on the ground. So that's just, again, a little introduction to who BSI is so that you're able to contextualize how we help companies throughout this really thought leadership presentation we'll provide from here on out. So we're here to talk to you today just about how to gain visibility into the multiple tiers of supplier relationships as it relates to the environmental space. So you see here on the screen a lot of different actors within the supply chain, and this may look a little bit like your supply chain potentially. So you may be that importer, the top player within the supply chain, but then you have different people acting on your behalf, different variations of suppliers. So you may have, an agent that contracts with different factories on your behalf to create a service or to produce a product. You may contract directly with different factories in different countries. Or you may have a vendor that you work with that has different factories and subcontractors underneath it. This diagram's not all-encompassing, but it does show how supply chains and the complexity behind multiple tier supplier relationships can cause blind spots for companies, especially when you're looking to start assess the environmental risk that may exist within your supplier base. And this type of visibility is essential in order to understand, where are your raw materials coming from, where are your source locations for different products and different areas of concern for your business. So we bring that up just to show you that, there are complexities, which is why we really need to take a holistic and due diligence approach to assessing these different complexities. So to just transition a bit into the environmental space, within the environmental space, there are a number of different targets, pieces of legislation, government-run initiatives that really force companies and organizations such as yourselves to do this type of risk assessment and understanding where you're supplying specific products from and how you're meeting these government-led targets and legislation pieces. And really, these take form in two parts, these targets and legislations. The first is what I would say product-specific pieces of regulations or voluntary schemes. So, governments across the European Union have come up with different legislative drivers on specific products that companies can produce and actually have created the legislation around these specific products. So on this screen here is really just an example. There are numerous pieces of legislation related to specific products that now you as a corporation have to comply with if you produce or manufacture these different component parts. So some of them are legislation pieces such as the European Union timber regulation. You are actually being required by the EU governing body to understand where your timber is being sourced and if it's being sourced from sustainable resources. You can't just go into a country like India, for example, and just source product of timber wherever you would like from whatever forest you want. There are certain regulations within the EU timber regulation that say they have to be from sustainable sources. They have to be from specific forest regulations. So that piece of example is, if any product that you're producing has this timber that falls underneath this EU regulation, you're going to be required to understand where does that timber come from? What is the source regulation around that timber? And that just oftentimes requires you to go down multiple tiers within your supply chain to understand, of all the products you have, which products have timber in it? And of those products that have timber in it, where are those products being sourced from? So you're starting to gain visibility now with these product-specific regulations as to the complexities behind finding out where those products are made. REACH is another good example of a product-specific regulation. You have to understand where specific chemicals are coming from within your supply chain, and not only understand where chemicals are coming from, but then again, a very first step to this process is understanding which products within your supply chain contain these chemicals. So you can actually go through the laboratory production of your different factories and understand, all right, this is the product we're making. What chemicals underneath the REACH regulations actually contain the chemicals that go into the products that you're delivering to your customers at the end. There's also things about, noise violations or, different eco design, so how you're actually building the products. There's regulations about different palm oils, there's metals, there's biocides. So, I came up with just a few specific examples here to show you that there are a lot of product-specific regulations that you probably are having to comply with now. And in order to comply with them, you really need to develop a risk assessment process that allows you to gain visibility into the multiple tiers of your supply chain. The second way I would say that regulations come from governments as it relates to environmental laws is there are EU regional targets, if you will. So there are different directives, frameworks that are created by the European Union that regulate more broader scale environmental issues, such as renewable energies, water conservation, preventing excessive noise, and things like emissions trading schemes. So, where are your, CO2 emissions, and what type of directives do you have to prevent excessive CO2 emissions? So how it works is the EU will set regional targets, and then underneath those regional targets is then up to the country oftentimes to actually set the regulation or set the piece of legislation that will then drive these targets to realization. I could have come up with a couple examples of what these country targets are, but to be honest, they're endless. Each country is different, but they still have the overall goal of protecting environment and protecting the environment from extra pollution or excess emissions of CO2, or trying to ensure that your supply chain has renewable energy sources. And these directives, they're becoming more and more regulated, and especially at the country level, there's a wide variety of different pieces of legislation that you will have to comply with, and it's understanding what does comply with mean. And oftentimes it's the pieces of legislation are really asking you to dig deeper and do a risk assessment on your supply chain so that you really do understand where your source countries are, what products are coming from those source countries, and then when those products are being made at the factory, what type of pollution and emissions are actually being carried out to produce the products on your behalf. And I think the key thing to remember here is, the factories that are actually producing the products on your behalf, they are an extension of your business. They are what you should care about as it relates to protecting the environment and meeting these EU regional targets in the individual country pieces of regulations. So it really does take you doing your due diligence to ensure that you as a company and your supply chain are doing the risk assessment to find out where you are complying with the pieces of regulations and where you may need to have some room for improvement to increase your compliance scores there. So that just outlines, just those last couple of slides just outlines the why you should care and why this is important. Why does environmental risk within the supply chain matter? I think it matters because you have to comply with these pieces of legislation that exist out there, but also it matters because this world is our oyster. We have to keep the sustainable sourcing and sustainable practices within our supplier and production manufacturing. So to move forward, I'm going to now detail, what does good look like? What does a best practice happen as it relates to supply chain environmental risk and assessing that risk? So let's just paint a picture here. Let's say your CEO is now at a shareholders meeting with media, stakeholders, non-governmental organizations, and he's being put under the spotlight. He or she is being put under the spotlight. And they're being asked some specific questions about supply chain concerns related to environmental threats. And it's questions such as these that they may start to be asked. And just as we go through this, think about, can your CEO answer these questions about your supply chain? Do you have a documented process to give your CEO these answers? So some of the first questions they may ask are, how many suppliers do you have? Do you even know the answer to that? Do they know the answer to that? How many direct suppliers do you have versus indirect suppliers? You may have a good handhold on where your direct suppliers are, but not necessarily where some of the indirect, or again, under those multiple layers and multiple tiers of suppliers. Where are your subcontracting environments? Where are your raw materials coming from? So once you've started identifying where your suppliers are and who they are, do you actually start having a profile on your suppliers? So do you have the right contact details? Do you have the right, where the factory is, the address, location? And then once you have that, it's, have you actually conducted an environmental risk assessment? These are the type of questions that the NGOs are going to start asking your CEO. What type of environmental risk assessment have you carried out? Have you done any on-site audits? If you have, where are the issues? What are the issues? Have you made any improvements towards correcting these issues? And I think the key point here is, as you're going through these questions, are the environmental risk assessment methodology you may adopt, does it reflect your core values of your organization? Each company has their own mottos, morals, mantra statements, corporate statements. Does your environmental risk assessment process actually meet and adhere to those values that you hold so dear across your organization? And at the end of the day, are you able to tell your supply chain story? I think it's really important for your upper level executives to be able to prove that they are doing your risk assessment process, they are carrying out a due diligence process for environment and sustainability issues. So what does good look like? I think the very first thing is what I was just trying to emphasize in the last point of, do your environmental practices adhere to your corporate values? And it's not just your corporate values, but also your corporate values across multiple divisions. So is your procurement division aligned with your risk and compliance divisions? Do you have the same objectives and goals that adhere to those corporate values? Are you keeping an active database of living profiles for your suppliers? Are you carrying out that risk assessment process related to the product type, the country, the critical items or environmental risk issues? Having that living risk assessment and living profile allows you then to categorize your suppliers and give them a risk rating, saying, here are my suppliers that are higher risk, here are my suppliers that are lower risk. And once you're able to categorize that, you then can say, okay, we then will be able to say, let's allocate our resources and activities to that highest, greatest area of risk. So then you're able to say, okay, we're going to now allocate financial resources for audits. And then once those audits are carried out, you're able to devote resources to corrective actions and improvement opportunities for your supplier base. So you're overall able to have a risk-based methodology for your suppliers, for environmental risk. And again, your CEO, your executives are actually able to tell your environmental supply chain story. So that's just to show, those are the questions that are starting to be asked of your CEO more and more often nowadays. They are starting to ask the very hard questions and really asking number-based questions. How many suppliers do you have? How many assessments have you carried out? How many audits have you carried out? And you want to be able to answer those questions and have your CEO and executives answer those questions on your behalf. So to help them answer those questions, my next phase of this webinar will be to show you and outline 3 key steps that you can start taking either to improve your current environmental risk assessment process or to develop a new environmental risk assessment process for your supply chain. So there are, again, like I said, 3 simple steps I think that companies can take in order to really do this type of due diligence and gain that broader visibility of environmental risk within your supplier base. So the 3 steps are, first, identifying your suppliers, understanding, which suppliers are your highest risks to your business, what products do they produce. And I think if you take a step back for one minute and think, okay, what is a risk assessment? Any risk professional will tell you that a risk assessment contains 3 parts: impact, vulnerability, and probability. And if you think about it, this first step we're talking about with identifying which of your suppliers are the highest risk to your business, that's the concept of impact, for example. So the concept of impact is understanding which of your suppliers are the greatest risk to your business for environmental concerns. The next step of analyzing geographic risk is when probability comes into play. So if you think about probability, you want to understand how probable is it for a country where I'm sourcing that there are high rates of CO2 emissions? Or for a country that I'm sourcing from, where are the highest rates of air pollution or water pollution? What are the environmental regulations there in that country? So those are some of the steps that you want to start understanding as how probable is it that there's going to be high rates of air pollution or water pollution in the countries where you're sourcing from. The third step is where you start getting into vulnerability. And this is actually where you're developing a set of criteria and assessing where some of your vulnerabilities are for environmental risk. And this is the actual questionnaire audit criteria that you want to start to develop. Okay, so now we're just going to go a bit further into the different steps. So again, going forward with the identification and an impact assessment, you want to understand, okay, where are my business risks for environment? And when you start understanding where your business risk for environment, the key parts are things like, product quality, where your commodities are being produced, the volume of business you do with that specific supplier, the spend, is it a single source supplier? So these are some of the key components that I think that most companies need to start taking into account when assessing the impact of your different suppliers on your overall supply chain. So when you're doing that, I think the key part is, in order to comply with some of the regulations that we spoke about earlier in this presentation, you need to understand what actual commodity is being produced by the suppliers and start tiering out or understanding the different phases of risk for the different commodities that your suppliers are producing. So there's 2 steps there, right? There's identifying who your suppliers are, then identifying what commodity is being produced by that supplier. And once you're starting to do that, you're starting to be able to create a matrix like you see here on the screen. So you're able to say, okay, here's the supplier name, here's the country that they're located in. Okay, good. Layer 2, what commodity do they produce? So when you start understanding what commodity they produce, you then start to understand how you can comply with some of the product-specific regulations for environment that are out there. So here on this matrix, you see things like paper. At the moment, there may be subtle paper restrictions for sourcing, but overall, there aren't any specific environmental regulations that are prominent within the space. So do you need to include them in your first phase of the risk assessment process? Probably not. Whereas you go down to the Maile chemical supplier, they're producing restricted chemicals as a raw material for your finished products. And there are, product-specific regulations like REACH, who actually require you to go out and carry out those environmental-specific pieces of legislation there. So that's another key component, I think, that you really need to be able to understand, where are your suppliers that are producing key commodities that go into your risk assessment process. So once you've understand who your suppliers are, you then want to start understanding the geographic risk behind your suppliers. So when you do that, you're starting to say, okay, we now understand who our suppliers are. Now we want to understand what are the threats of the countries where my suppliers are located. Every country has a different threat. Every country has a different environmental risk concern. So you need to start understanding which countries are your highest risk and where are the biggest threats to environmental pollution, emissions, degradation for where you're operating as a business. So you're able to see here, okay, here's BSI's screen intelligence tool that I talked to you about earlier. This is our global heat map for environmental overall risks. This is our overarching environmental risk indicator. You can see here that there's a threat rating low to severe on a 5-point scale that actually paints the world according to our threat rating. So, low being the lowest threat in green and severe being the highest threat in red. And once you're able to start understanding these country risk indicators here, you then can start saying, okay, well, which of these suppliers located in which countries are then ones that I want to incorporate into my overall risk assessment process, and ones that I want to ensure are incorporated to the overarching supplier risk assessment process. So if you look at, let's do an example. So if you look at Malaysia, Malaysia has a number of different threat indicators for environment. So we have elevated threat for the overarching environment indicator. We have a guarded threat that BSI assesses for water pollution, a high threat of corruption, guarded threat for air pollution, elevated threat for renewable energy sources, and a high threat for CO2 abatement. Whereas if you compare Malaysia's risk landscape to China's risk landscape, you see a bit of a different perspective for China. China is a severe threat for environment overall, severe threat for water pollution, severe threat for air pollution. So you can drastically see that, your suppliers that are located in Malaysia versus just suppliers that are operating in China have drastically different threat environmental risk landscapes, for example. So you really need to understand where are your highest risk countries so that you're then able to hone in your efforts and focus on the suppliers that are in your highest risk countries, again, that are producing some of the products that are highest risk to your business. So an example that you also want to be able to take into account when you're analyzing geographic risk is, what is the regulatory environment like in the country where you're operating? So here on the screen, you're able to see that China has taken strides, we'll say, to stopping pollution. A $1.6 billion was invested last year into stopping pollution in the country. They did make 8,400 arrests for violation of environmental laws. However, it's not enough. They're making baby steps, but the environmental pollution problem in China is so bad that they're estimating that it may take $322 billion each year to stop the pollution. And that's a huge amount of investment that China will need to make to be able to counter the problem of the severe threat of pollution like we talked about. There are also issues, I think, of companies falsifying their environmental data when they're reporting environmental degradation in China. And basically the problem is so vast that you really need to understand what are the norms in the country and then be able to put improvement processes and corrective actions for your suppliers located in that country so that you can counter the broad problem that already is inherent within the Chinese landscape. Okay, so you've now at this stage, you've done your identification of suppliers, so you've done your impact assessment. With the country risk, you're able to do the probability assessment and understanding how probable is it that my suppliers will be high scale polluters in that country. Is it part of the norm? How do I counter that? And then step 3 is when you start taking vulnerability and compliance into your risk assessment process. And this is where you start incorporating your actual risk criteria. So, here's where you really want to get procurement involved. Here's where you really want to start aligning your key characteristics as it relates to what are your overall organizational goals of your environmental risk program. What is most important to you? Is it, air pollution? Is it noise? Is it CO2 emissions? Is it, the regulatory compliance that you may need to engage in. So these are the type of conversations you need to start having in your business across your divisions. One of the things that's going to make your risk program most successful is having procurement, having risk, having compliance all involved within the initiative to develop an overarching risk program for your environmental compliance. So you start creating the goals and criteria of your vulnerability assessment as the first stage. Then you say, okay, now I've got my questionnaire. I'm ready to send it out to my suppliers. So you say, okay, I'm going to send out the assessment to my suppliers. You receive your responses back to, let's say, the supplier in China versus the supplier in Malaysia. And each of the suppliers respond 70% compliant, or they're vulnerable up to 70% with your questionnaire that you've sent out to them. That's what we would call the traditional approach. Most companies will therefore assume that those two suppliers are equal risk for environmental compliance. When in actuality, if you start taking into account the country risk of those two suppliers, you see that China, again, highlights as severe risk, whereas Malaysia highlights as an overall elevated risk. So in actuality, those two suppliers are not equal. The supplier in Malaysia is just facing a lesser risk landscape than the supplier in China. The norms of pollution, the norms of emissions, the norms of environmental degradation are less in Malaysia than they are in China. So the supplier in China is where you should hone in and focus your vulnerability risk and compliance initiatives so that you have a better understanding of where your weaknesses are and then correct them accordingly. And I would say that some of the things that you are and should do as a part of your vulnerability assessment is take the automated approach. Make this job easier for you. There are automated software tools like the BSI Supplier Compliance Manager out there that allow you to take some of this assessment facilitation and sending out assessment questionnaires or uploading on-site audit results into an audit platform so that you have what you can see here, a macro level dashboard of visibility into where are your executive level risks, so your CEO can pass that stress test for environment, or also where are your supplier specific risks, so where are your risk reports, what is your tolerance to risk. And an automated platform allows you to be more efficient and be more effective when you're assessing and managing the vulnerability approach when you're assessing the vulnerability risk approach to environmental risk. So here's where I think there's a lot of room for improvement for companies who are already attempting to do a vulnerability assessment for their suppliers on environmental risk. You want to take that next step and be the best in class practice in implementing an automated solution so that you can easily analyze where the risks are and then, like I said, correct the risks before they become a problem for NGOs to notice. So that's really where we're starting to take into account. Once you've done the automated risk assessment, you can then start prioritizing who are your suppliers that are your highest risk. So you can start seeing, okay, I've got my suppliers here who are my severe risk and my high risk suppliers. Those are the ones who've completed assessments so far. Let's hone in and really take a focused approach on those suppliers that are the highest risk so that you're then able to take into account and allocate financial resources to correcting those risks through the corrective actions through the tool, or so that you're able to even do on-site audits and allocate the financial resources for on-site auditing in the highest risk suppliers. So you have a more overarching holistic risk assessment process for your environmental program if you take this step-by-step approach to mitigating the overall environmental risk for your supply chain. So just to review, what are the key components of a risk-based sourcing program for environmental risk? The first is identify who are your high-risk suppliers, where are your suppliers that have the biggest impact on your business. So I think, again, taking into account the products that are subject to the regulatory environment of government legislation, understanding where those products are being produced and by whom is really the first step in identifying your impact. Again, second step would be analyzing the country risk or environmental risk on your different countries where you're sourcing from. So utilizing things like the intelligence system of BSI with the heat maps and qualitative analysis that comes in behind the heat maps. So you understand what is the regulatory environment in that country, what are the norms for CO2 emissions, what are the norms for water and air pollution, and really getting that macro level country picture there. Step 3 being, where is your risk assessment? Where is your vulnerability assessment? How are you able to take into account some of these areas of risk so that you understand where the risks are specifically within your suppliers so that you can then take your due diligence steps to actually correcting those risks. I think that's a key point in your vulnerability step is not just identifying, where your suppliers need improvement, but then making sure you take them on the journey of improvement. And once you're able to carry out these 3 steps is really where I think the holistic risk scoring takes into account. So you're able to really say, okay, I've now done each step in analyzing and assessing my risk. I now am confident in the risk-based assessment that I've encountered for my environmental program. Here are my highest risk suppliers. Provide these answers to your executives so that they know how to answer those CEO stress tests, how to answer to the regulatories that may come knocking at the door to ask where you're compliant and where you're not. I think these are key steps into the overall environmental program that you want to develop. And the last thing I'll just say is just, again, with the risk assessment approach, make sure you're taking into account the impact, probability, and vulnerability so that you have that holistic viewpoint. So in conclusion, there's a lot of reasons why you should engage in an environmental risk assessment program. There's many regulatory drivers for products. There are many regulatory targets and legislation for overall environmental issues like emissions or pollution or key areas of overall environmental sustainability issues. But at the end of the day, you want to also protect your brand. If one day one of those media sources does find that your suppliers are engaged in environmental wrongdoings, it's going to have a direct impact on your brand and your reputation. And nowadays, I think that companies and consumers really are putting more value in a company's brand and reputation than they are in the actual products that they are producing. So make sure you protect that brand. Make sure that you protect that reputation. You have strived so hard to create that positive brand value. And the way to do that is making sure that you are doing your environmental due diligence and in creating a risk assessment program so you're able to really thoroughly assess and identify where the risks are for your business. So this time, again, I want to thank you for your attention and your interest, and we look forward to having you on future webinars with BSI. Thank you and have a good day.